Back in 2022, when I was named to the top 100 women in cannabis by the Cannabis at Work organization and community, I was excited. Look at the potential in the space. I mean, it's new to Canada. It's 5 years old as a recreational adult use commodity, way longer as a medical product. And there is so much more to dissect to really understand better the true potential of this legal plant. And while I don't directly work in cannabis or work with cannabis, I lead change across data analytics and insights. And I have often occupied roles and positions where my adjacent data curious, story rich fields that have enabled me to speak about this plant and use research technologies, techniques, and approaches to dissect the true market potential of cannabis at global forums. I remember the first one at IEX in Austin, Texas, and how tremendous that was, and then followed that up with several other appearances and presentations and gatherings and events that dissected this topic, this area of business, the caveats and opportunities, milestones, obstacles, all of that, and got acquainted with a tremendous community of business leaders, very diverse, very different, and interested in the same things that business leaders in data also are interested in. So it was a unique intersection, and important questions like, where does medical cannabis stand with relation to recreational use? Now, medical has been around way longer legally as a product than recreational use cannabis in Canada. And but what does that mean in terms of adoption, in terms of with relation to healthcare communities, physician communities? What about stigma, education, misinformation? How are we dealing with all that? Public safety. And then what about brand differentiation across these different user segments, whether it's adult use, wellness segments, or any other emerging and evolving segments? And what are these upcoming regulations we need to know about? And what are some trends that are really worrying or exciting business leaders in cannabis today? For all this and more, I really hope you enjoy watching highlights from our last Cannabis Insights Forever conference. It's a conference I hold once a year, an annual holiday tradition, as I like to call it, early December. And the last one was called World's Best Weed and Web3 Data Stories Conference. And I really hope you tune into these highlights and get back to me. If these topics excite you and interest you, I'd love to have you be a part of our 2024 lineup. And give your brand the visibility or the other opportunities that you may be interested in as we work together to shining a light on cannabis insights, innovations, and opportunities, and come and make and break new milestones with us. Thank you, and this is Arundhati Dandapani, founder and CEO, Generation1.ca, signing off. Welcome to the World's Best Weed and Web3 Data Stories annual virtual conference. We do this every year, pleased to bring together leaders from around different spaces interested or invested in cannabis, cannabis insights, and paint a better story about what's going on, what we've achieved, where our businesses facing challenges, where our individuals facing challenges, and where the economy is moving, and how all this translates to skills of the future as well. A lot of people have set their eyes on this ever since the pandemic. Legal cannabis proving to be a high source of employment across Canada and the US. One of the top sources as well. So looking forward to having some stimulating discussions with several diverse folks you must have met in our last conference, as well as through our other programs before. So I am the founder of Generation1.ca, a platform focused on integrating newcomers to Canada and US, North America, placing them at the forefront of data and insights innovation globally. And we have one of our initiatives is called the Cannabis Insights Forever initiative that puts on this annual virtual meeting gathering, exclusive gathering to shed some insights on how the state of legal cannabis is evolving. And we work with our partner, the Cannabis Marketing Association in Denver, Colorado, where they're a platform sponsor, and we're also proudly sponsored by today's event is also proudly sponsored by CanDelta, whose CEO today is here with us as well. Hope you all enjoy this session. It's really geared towards education, and it's also geared towards understanding what this means for you, your business, and for society and culture. So thank you to all those who've joined me today. I'd like to first begin with opening our panel, our World's Best Weed and Web3 Data Stories panel.
So before we begin our panel, I'd like to first share who all we have with us today. A few more might join in as we speak, and they will also introduce themselves. So we have with us seven leaders who are going to introduce themselves. You can see them on gallery view. To my left is Lisa Buffo. That's Lisa. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Arundhati. Good morning, everybody. I'm Lisa. I'm the founder and CEO of the Cannabis Marketing Association. Like she mentioned, we're based in Denver, Colorado, but we are a membership-based organization focused on education and best practices for industry marketers and communications professionals more broadly. We host the Cannabis Marketing Summit, which is our annual conference in June in Denver. And we do content throughout the year. So our members, we do webinars, we have blog posts, we do research with our members, and really help sort of steer the direction around where cannabis marketing is going and help folks remain compliant, connect with each other, and learn about best practices. So that's a little bit about us. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I see next on the screen, Craig.
Thank you. Craig Warden with Polaris Strategic Insights, one of Canada's leading public opinion and market research firms, and with a very strong cannabis research practice that we launched back in 2015 when we saw legalization coming on the horizon. So we do a lot of work for governments, but also a lot of work in the private sector for cannabis producers and retail organizations, and happy to be here today. Thank you.
Greg, let's move on to Michelle.
Thank you. I'm Michelle Arbus. I run the research at Streamprint, and we're a company that collects cannabis use data from medical and rec patients on a mobile app. And so patients can understand what works best for them in terms of the products, the dose, what they're treating. And we also gather all the chemical profile data. So we're able to use that and work with producers, governments, regulators, anyone who wants to understand what kinds of compounds work for what kinds of symptoms and how it makes people feel.
Thank you. We have with us Sherry Budram, who introduced herself. She's one of our sponsors. Thank you for being here as well.
Thank you, Arundhati. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Sherry Budram. I'm the CEO and co-founder of CanDelta. I'm a chemist by training and formerly worked with Health Canada for a number of years in their medical cannabis program as a senior compliance and enforcement officer before founding CanDelta. At CanDelta, we are a regulatory and scientific cannabis consulting company. We have an office in downtown Toronto as well as in New York. So we largely service companies who are looking to enter the cannabis space and those who are operating in the cannabis space so that they stay compliant and run a successful business. So our service offerings really vary to really cater to those types of individuals and participants in the cannabis industry. So it could range from completing licensing applications and amendments to conducting site audits, providing quality assurance support, technical document writing, business plans, market research, just general compliance, education, and training. So we don't necessarily collect data ourselves, in the same manner that other panelists may in the capacities of their business, but we do in the sense of, we have a large purview of what others in the industry are looking to achieve and how they potentially like to collect information and are looking for means of collecting information and really optimizing their business.
Thank you. We have next Ada Lee.
Hi. Yeah, nice to meet everybody. I'm Ada. I'm the Vice President Strategy at a behavioral science consulting firm called BE Works. So at BE Works, all we do is behavioral science, and everybody on our team, including myself, are behavior change experts. And not exactly from the cannabis space, but the unique lens that we bring is all around how do we change perceptions and behaviors around, just about anything, and that could include cannabis. So that's me.
Thank you. And now we have this Rachel, who was there with us last year as well.
Thank you. So happy to be back and lovely to see everyone. My name's Rachel Kollick, and I'm the founder of a brand strategy firm called Y Creative. And we help cannabis brands get clarity on the unique value that they offer to the marketplace. And most importantly, why anyone should care particularly about their brand. And then we help them communicate that value to the people that they want to join the journey. So their investors or shareholders, their customers, of course, their community, and often governments as well, of course, since we're still in the works of trying to get our regulations right. So we work with brands all across the supply chain, from retailers to laboratories to producers, both in Canada and the US and across the globe. Happy to be back. Thanks for having me.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And I think we've gone over everyone who's here right now. That looks like a wonderful, robust panel, and look forward to hearing everyone's thoughts and seeing what they've been doing in the past year. Let's take it from the theme of the world's best weed and Web3 brands. So what you think are the world's best weed and Web3 brands out there? I mean, there's a number of brands I can name, and some of you are here as well, both at the leading intersection of technology and weed and more. And how are these brands leveraging blockchain, cryptocurrency, non-fungible tokens, and more to improve transparency, tracking supply, maybe improve the quality of supply chain management? Everyone's talking about it, especially post-COVID. So maybe what are some of your favorite Web3 and weed brands, and what are some examples of how they're changing the industry, perhaps? Should we start with someone who's very actively observing Web3? Michelle, do you want to start?
Sure. So at Streamprint, we, as I said, we are collecting data through our app on patients and rec users on what they're using and how they're feeling. So one of the things that, since we have a medical focus, one of the things that really gets us upset, I guess, is that, products can be switched, or products like in the supply chain, I ran out of this, I'm going to just use that, where patients buy it at the store. And we really understand how important it is for a specific product to be used by a certain person, if that's really what is going to help them with whatever they're treating. So it's an issue. It's a big issue. I mean, mostly for the medical channel. But one of the things that Streamprint's working on is with international markets developing, like in Europe or Australia, we're working on a technology that is going to include blockchain, traceable blockchain technology, where products will be traceable in a transparent way, and the use data can be, our use data can be attached to it. So if a company in Germany or wherever is Switzerland going to be buying or importing cannabis, we're going to have a way to allow it to be traceable, to make sure that the right genetic is getting to the customer and attaching our use data to it. So I think, we're working on this, and we think it's going to be a really, really important thing for patients and for users around the world.
Rachel, you work a lot with both medical cannabis, but also you have a lot to say about brands, the world's best brands out there. So what are your observations on the intersection of weed and Web3 brands?
Yeah, I mean, if Michelle hadn't jumped in, I would have said for her. Streamprint, I think, has always been one of the earliest brands. I'm super proud they're a Canadian brand. I think, they're doing some really remarkable things and have been for years. And I think it's interesting, they sort of opened the door. Well, their current application is medical. I think, rec users have the exact same problem, right? I find a brand in my local store, I like it, but product is limited, and our distributors control sort of how much goes to which stores at which times, and that's one of the biggest frustrations for retailers. I think Web3 to me is, I think the most interesting thing for brands is personalization is what's really coming. And I think Streamprint and sort of what they're building, and that sort of recognition that cannabis is unique to each individual. And it isn't sort of like typical CPG in that way, where we can kind of make blatant recommendations about experience to large groups of people and expect them all to have that kind of predictable experience. So I think that idea of really getting to understand through applications like Streamprint how those effects are linked to different products, being able to then interlink products together. So if this product worked for you, here's a phenotype, a profile, a terpene report that's quite similar that might then also work for you in that same way. That's going to be applicable to the rec market just as much as it is to the medical, as the market matures, as the customer matures and really understands what this whole cannabis world is about and sort of how to relate to it. And so then in comes the opportunity for AI and like personalized recommendation based on what you've used before, how you told strain print or another application it worked for you and how it made you feel, and what you should recommend next time based on what's available at your local retail store. That to me is like, from a consumer standpoint, really exciting for the personalization factor, but also super powerful from the like brand affinity and brand awareness to really start creating a one-to-one relationship from brand to consumer, which is something we don't have yet in most mature markets, even in California, Colorado, right? There's the distributor, the retailer, the bud tender standing in between you and the customer. So I think part of Web3 and what folks like Strain Print are doing is really opening the door for that much more personal experience, which I think is great for all of us.
Sherry, what have you been observing of the best brands doing leveraging Web3 technologies, and are you using any of it yourself in your business and operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say that from a sort of like, like a brand recognition point of view and collection of data and really understanding, where the market is going in terms of, products and their overall experiences, Strain Print and Leafly are probably two brands that, come to mind, I think, with a lot of individuals in the industry, but it really depends on where you're really sitting. Right. For our business, we like getting that data. We're writing business plans and helping to advise our clients on certain aspects. There is a lot of interest in how blockchain plays into seed to sale tracking, as inventory control is critical to compliance of regulations throughout the supply chain. So from that perspective, there are definitely areas that are of more interest in its application on where you are really applying that to your business. Platforms like CryptoStrain that really leverages blockchain and representing a unique strain, so that there are some potential applications for having some like IP rights over particular genetics. I'm seeing that in areas where there are interest specifically on genes and research and development. And then, as we know, we're in an industry that does face a lot of, financial barriers, and seeing that there are movement towards having a decentralized finance system that can really allow for new approaches to banking, especially in areas like the US, where cannabis is not federally legal. Where there are challenges certainly with banking at the federal level. So just trying to see how we can really take this, the more innovative ways of these types of technologies to leverage it to advance the industry and help to combat some of the traditional industry challenges that you see in many industries, but also some of the ones that are more unique to cannabis specifically.
Okay. Lisa, you have a lot of members. I mean, what problems are your members facing in terms of, or with these Web3 technologies? Are they asking you for advice on, how do we leverage it better to improve? What our other panelists mentioned, brand memorability, or customer attention, loyalty, or even education. What are you seeing, Lisa?
We do get asked that all the time. I would say not necessarily from the Web3 perspective these days. I mean, the conversation here a lot is around AI and like what different tools that you can use. I think I can speak to those strategies and like what folks are doing. And I will definitely say that now is the time where everyone's planning for next year and what's 2024 going to look like and what strategies are they going to implement. At least here in the US, the biggest thing for us from a marketing perspective is possible rescheduling next year. So right now in the US, cannabis is Schedule 1, which is incredibly restrictive. So there's so many marketing and advertising channels that aren't available, but also the way our tax code is your marketing expenses are not deductible as a part of that. And if cannabis gets rescheduled, which we're actually predicting it will go Schedule 3, end of Q2, beginning of Q3, so around next summer, just based on averages of length of time that's happened of rescheduling in the past, then that 280E tax code would go away and marketing budgets could change overnight. So one of the big things we're talking about is that we estimate, based on what we've heard from our members, that marketing budgets here are probably about 1% of annual revenue, plus or minus, kind of depending on the space. And if you look at data from other spaces, Gartner does an annual survey on what do CMOs spend as far as percent of annual revenue. And on average across industries, that number is 9%. So what we've been talking with our members about is that we have this opportunity to plan budget-wise and say, hey, if our budgets are going to go up, or could in theory, because now you can write off this expense, for a baseline, perhaps up to 9% from 1% next year, what would you spend that money on? So I think folks have sort of had this toolkit about, what can we use for customer retention, customer loyalty, and they've been using certain tools that have been available and are somewhat limited in this space, but also don't have a ton of money to put behind it. And now they're looking at it from, what could we spend now? How would that change? What tools become available to us, given that that's coming next year? So kind of a long way to answer that, but I will just say that conversation is changing now based on our resources, and availability to those resources might be changing. So how might that impact strategy? And that's an ongoing conversation here in the States, at least.
Ada, in Canada, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in memorable brands and brands being memorable? What are they doing that others aren't doing?
It's interesting. I think that there was something that I think Rachel said that I jotted down onto a sticky note, which is that there still isn't a lot of direct communication, I guess, from brands direct to consumers, even in Canada, right? And even if there are, it's quite constrained and limited even today. I mean, granted, as I said, I'm not an expert in all things cannabis, but from a behavioral science or perception change perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunity, into next year and the years beyond, to really build up that sort of direct communication between brands and consumers, as long as regulatory, things permit. And one of the things I think is really key as brands are setting up that ability to directly market to consumers is really keeping in mind that ultimately brands to a consumer, it's merely a mental shortcut. In a lot of the work that we've done with CPG companies, a lot of our clients, when we work with them, because you're in the space and this is your everyday, you talk about your own brands all the time. There's almost like a curse of knowledge that you have about your own brand, and you come to assume that other people will care a lot more about your brand and who you are than they really do. And the reality is that consumers think about brands in like milliseconds. It's very little time is spent, and so the more simple and straightforward the brand is for people to understand, as a mental shortcut, as a heuristic, the easier it is for people to remember it, especially when they're new to the world of cannabis. So, based on a lot of the work that we've done in the CPG and the retail space outside of cannabis, this is almost always true. The simpler, the more one-dimensional your brand is as it's perceived by the consumer, the easier it is for people to remember. So, for example, if I was to say IKEA, I think many of us, if I ask you, what are the first 5 words that come to mind when I say IKEA, I can bet that all the words that we would come up with, they are basically synonyms of each other. And this is a signal that IKEA as a brand is simple enough and strong enough in its messaging that consumers very immediately grasp exactly what it is. And I would encourage cannabis brands to think through that and whether their brand is able to signal very quickly in consumers' minds these same words across all the different consumers. And one of the ways that we've assessed whether brands are strong and simple and memorable is through something called semantic association test. It's very, very simple. All you've got to do is present your brand and its logo and everything about it to a consumer and just say what are the first 10 words that come to mind, and they just list them off. You collect enough data across enough consumers, you can start to assess what do people associate with your brand, what do they not, what are their misconceptions, and how much do you overlap with competitors. So you can start to map out where you need to uniquely differentiate yourselves from competitors and what that strong messaging needs to be for yourself. So it's a long way of saying there's a lot of opportunity, I think, for cannabis brands in Canada to start to work on how to strongly communicate themselves out to consumers in a way that differentiates them. Maybe it's the same in the US, but there's a lot of clutter right now, I think, in Canada. There's always this joke, right? You walk down a street and there's like 10 different stores with 100 brands, and it's just everywhere. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to start for brands to start like really differentiate themselves in the consumers' minds.
How can we differentiate in Canada, Craig? Do you have any observations about brands that you're seeing, whether it's with new cannabinoids or other types of methods, or even Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, in Canada, we have such a strict set of regulations that as a consequence, brands can't do the things that brands like to do in terms of marketing and creative. And that's really held back brand awareness almost across the entire industry, and brand loyalty and connection. So what we're seeing is that, only about 3 or 4 brands even have half of users aware of those brands when we run down a list of all the brands available. And those tend to be Aurora and Canopy and their other brand Tweed. Those are always at the top, and everybody else is far, far below that. Where we're seeing brand loyalty and connection emerge is actually less on the producer side, but more on the retail side, right? So people are very much connected to their local store that they prefer. And it is having that local store is probably the primary determinant, less so than the brand, but that's where those stores can establish relationships with their clients by having their loyalty programs in place and having emails go out with promotions, rewards programs, and so on. And that's where we're seeing brand connection and loyalty really develop, is with that local store that gets people involved in their loyalty programs. Yeah.
Michelle, do you have any thoughts about differentiating on, for medical brands specifically?
I do. I think that, as we've all just said, it's a commoditized product now, and you can walk down the street and have 10 stores within 1 kilometer. And when you go in, they all are like, mushed together, and you really are at the whim of the bud tender. But I think there's a couple of things. I think a company or a brand can differentiate themselves with innovative products. And I think there's a huge challenge on how to get those products in the hands of consumers and in the minds of consumers. But we see often new cannabinoids or new delivery methods or things that are really innovative, and companies that focus on designing a product with a specific goal in mind for an outcome. And I think that, I guess, on our side, working with such companies, we see all the work that's going into it. But once they get onto the market, like, it's really impossible to communicate your products to customers. I think it's on the medical side, though, patients are really dependent on the producers if they're aligned with their clinics or with the company, because many of them have their own clinics. So I know Aurora, for example, they have a lot of veterans as their customers, and they really want to understand them. They're doing research to understand them. They really want to be able to help them. And I think some companies, especially with a medical focus, really it can come across in as little communication as they have with customers, just some communication to say more than try this new product or whatever they can say. It's just like they want to understand them. They want the patients that they care, because I think in this environment, there's no education, there's no other information. You're really at the whim of the producer or of the retailer. So I think when it comes to medical patients, especially knowing that your producer or your clinic like really does care about you, and I think they can communicate that in different ways, is really important. Because I think even just what we talked about at the beginning, the switching products and things like that, it doesn't make the customer, medical or rec, really have confidence in the system. So I think just a really communication, but as we know, it can't really focus on the product, right? You can't communicate any claims about your product. You can't communicate anything really. So just being able to, what we see is with medical patients, especially, really show them that, like, try to understand them, understand that you are working to help them fill their needs, help them get better, help them feel better. I think that goes a long way. I think the rec market is really difficult because there is such clutter and you can't communicate anything. But Health Canada is only getting stricter with their regulations on what you can say. So it is really difficult for a rec brand. And I think new products, new delivery methods can separate them from the crowd. But then how do you even get those in customers or in retailers is a whole other issue. So it's tough.
And you all, I think, talked about product quality a little bit. So maybe let's understand that a bit more, because it's really the biggest factor, with driving a lot of the purchases. So, I mean, we have the customer experience sector also in this space growing as the market matures, even though, there's a lot of criticism also. So what do you think cannabis brands should focus on more to improve product and then to improve the customer experience? Because we have issues like counterfeiting and adulteration, like some of you mentioned, the authenticity of the product not being clear, or consumers not being assured of the safety or the quality of it. So from the product quality standpoint, Sherry, have you been having have you seen any changes in this year that have surprised you or encouraged you?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall consumers are just becoming more wise on, how important product quality is, not just in cannabis, but in many other products that are out there, right? Because wellness is becoming a more important factor. I think people are just, more educated and taking more ownership of their own health and their own wellness. And it is becoming definitely important. It becomes challenging from the perspective of when a customer wants to get more information on a product. We do know in Canada that the regulations are quite strict in that a product can only be released once it meets certain test criteria and specifications. So from a quality standpoint, the regulations are really set out to ensure product quality and safety, as long as you're buying legal product. Where quality starts to become an issue, or from the consumer's perspective, is when they're looking at things like package on date, right? Cannabis products don't necessarily have to go through stability studies, so in terms of shelf life, it's not really the same as it is for other food products, for example. So when you're looking at package on date, customers will say, okay, well, I know that this was packaged however many months ago. The OCS and other provincial bodies are becoming more strict on, what products they accept that fall within, acceptable range of freshness, for example. So that's kind of a way that's being managed from the quality perspective in that aspect. Going back to what you were talking a little bit before about the brands and what the brands do, It is certainly challenging in our industry here because in the US, but also in Canada because of the strict marketing and advertising and promotion regulations that really prevent brands from effectively marketing themselves, and they have to be very strategic in how they get to the consumer. And it becomes even more complex when there are brands that are not license holders and they're working with a licensed entity to either co-pack for them. And that's very, very common. Where you see brands, they're not the licensed entity, but they're working with a license holder and they're white labeling and have their brand. And from an ownership perspective, it's difficult for them to promote their own product outside of what the license holder is doing. I had a client this week that got a warning letter from Health Canada because they held events to help promote their brand. They, have a website, and Health Canada was like, hey, like, you're not supposed to do that. You're not a licensed entity, right? So that totally changes their business. And how did they get around that? And they were doing it from a perspective of, really not trying to be non-compliant. They're trying to educate the customer on the product, in parallel with the license holder. And they, but from Health Canada's perspective, they're saying, okay, well, this is misleading, right? So how can the brands work cohesively with the licensed entity and really come up with a strategy that can satisfy the regulations and also get to the customer? So there's always this constant balance. And the challenging thing too is that advertising and promotion and marketing is in the regulations a bit of a gray area. You can interpret it differently depending on how you apply it and who's reading it. So a lot of companies don't think that they're being non-compliant, but Health Canada might have a different perspective. So that makes it really challenging. And I think the other thing I wanted to say about that is it seems like there's always a big focus on the existing customers and the existing consumers in the industry. When you're thinking about getting new customers, that's like a whole other complexity, because if you think about, maybe you don't drink alcohol, but everyone knows who Molson is, right? Or Budweiser, or you might not shop at Lululemon, but everyone knows who Lululemon is. It's not like that in cannabis. If you're not a cannabis consumer, how do you even know which brand to even go to? How do you even position your brand marketing to get new customers? Whether you're a brand yourself or you're a license holder or you're a retailer, it's very complex in that manner. So any technology or any other strategies, I'm not necessarily an expert in that. I'll leave it to the other folks on the panel, but yeah, I commend you for having a difficult job and trying to navigate that. Those are just some things to consider.
This also brings up pricing, and maybe we can talk about that later, but I'd love to hear more as well, a little bit more on product quality. Maybe Lisa, Rachel, if you could share what you're thinking, what your thoughts are for product quality, and then I'd like to also understand something about how has pricing evolved recently.
That one's a bit harder for me to speak to because I'm definitely more on the marketing side, but I will just say that here in the mature markets, it's very oversaturated. So consumers have a lot of options and it's very competitive. So folks are competing really on price. And there is definitely a difference between what is top shelf and what is bottom shelf. But because there's this price suppression, overall, the quality, I would say, is fairly good. And advanced consumers, I would say, have more of a nuanced knowledge of what's the difference between if you might grade something like A, B, or C level, versus what is not. But overall, we have a price suppression problem. So, and I will also say that the biggest competition here in the US is the unregulated market. There are still a lot of cannabis coming out of the West Coast, California, going across state lines, going to the East Coast, that is not a part of the regulated market. And that is a whole different conversation when it comes to quality and what that means for the broader implications. But just tying it back into folks who are brands sort of competing for each other's customers versus trying to get new folks who are out there who maybe haven't tried or gotten into this space at all, or are buying definitely lower quality, arguably, from the unregulated market is, I would say, in some part I don't know if it's necessarily a bigger problem, but it's definitely a factor as opposed to consumers buying on brands because this one is very clearly better from a product quality perspective than the other when you've got the price issue and the unregulated market issue as a problem. For example, I actually live in Ohio now, in Cleveland, which is where I grew up, and we just passed issue 2. So as of yesterday now, you won't get arrested if you have less than 2.5 ounces. They still haven't implemented adult use as far as going to the dispensary, but Ohio's had medical for years now. We're about a 3-hour drive from Detroit. So many people I know drive to Detroit to go get their cannabis from Michigan because it is so much cheaper. Even though there's plenty of products coming through the state, whether or not you're getting it from the medical side, wherever on the West Coast. So I can't speak too directly necessarily to what regulators are doing or what's happening. I will definitely say folks are trying to compete on the innovation side. There's a company here called Wana that they're big. I believe they're in Canada as well, but they have because you can't make claims and do all those things, but they're innovating in their products where they have 2 different sleep products, one for going asleep and one for staying asleep. So there's folks doing things like that that I would argue are on the quality side, because those you would think, oh, just a sleep gummy, and they've actually teased that out and marketed it as those 2 separate things. So kind of a long answer to that, but there's more factors, I think, in play, at least here, than not when it comes to product quality and how the regulators and brands might be approaching it, because we don't have federal, we don't have the environment that you guys have up in Canada as far as it having federal approval for all of it.
What are you seeing with brands innovating to improve their product quality in
Yeah,
Canada?
I think it's really interesting. In the first few years, we had this battle over quality, right? Because it was the first time companies were scaling to massive scales to grow cannabis at that scale. It was very difficult, much more difficult than many of them anticipated it being. So we had this glut of really bad cannabis that nobody can sell. And it was the race to quality. And that was the game, is the first to the best is going to win the game. Well, that game, like we now have seen, is well, now there's no lack of quality at every price point you might want to choose from, in every vertical and every category. I would argue there's multiple brands putting out really good quality product on a really regular basis. So my feeling is that cannabis needs to mature in how it understands marketing anything, right? So we've really focused too much on the product, and that is why you get tripped up in sort of all of the marketing regulations, is focusing too much on product features and attributes and things like that, and not enough on brand, not enough on affinity, awareness, understanding. Ada mentioned earlier IKEA. I think it's a great example. Lisa just mentioned Wana. I think, Wana teasing apart something like a sleep gummy is getting to use cases. We're going beyond this idea of focusing on cannabinoids and terpenes and just mixing them together in different ratios and trying to just throw stuff at the wall, figuring out exactly what the customer wants, and starting to break down actual individual use cases and figuring out when and why do people use cannabis, and what products then are necessary in that use case, and how do we market to that need state versus that product attribute. And that's the maturation of CPG. That's really treating cannabis like a consumer product and creating a brand that has values, and those values then are expressed through the products that we create, versus the other way around. Right now, cannabis brands and cannabis companies start with the product and try and work backwards. Most of my clients come to me, they've been in market for multiple years with product, very little or no brand really at all, and now see themselves in a race to the bottom for price, and in a nobody even knows who we are and can't pick us off the shelves. So that's the maturation we need to go through. And we can talk about, well, how does AI help that? How does blockchain help some of those things? But I really think if my best advice, if you're starting a brand today or if you're already on shelf, whether it's medical or rec, is stop talking about the product and start figuring out who you are in general, and what will lead everything you will do as a company, as a brand, and why will people want to join your journey and then therefore consume everything you make. I mean, if you're an IKEA lover, you know that if you need anything for your home, you will just go to IKEA and they will have a number of incredible versions that you will want, and you will take home and you will put it together yourself and feel like a superhero. That's IKEA. And that's what millions of people all around the world buy it every day, for the brand value, not necessarily for the individual widgets it creates in the world, Those widgets are just an expression of who they are. So that to me is like where we need to go, and how we move from quality of a product, an individual widget, that yeah, that gummy is good, and good and quality, as we all know, means lots of different things to lots of different people. We're currently having a conversation around, is THC really a marker for quality when it's the number one thing we're selling a product based on? No, of course not. So maturing away from the widgets inside the product and trying to figure out the application of that product to an individual's lives and what they're experiencing and what they want to experience, I think is really the next phase of like cannabis branding in general. And is your best strategy, if you're a brand, in getting around the marketing regulations, because the marketing regulations talk about products and making promises about products, not about your brand. You can say everything about your brand. You can make brand statements all day long in all kinds of environments. So that I think is the transition for a lot of people have yet to make in cannabis branding.
Thank you. Craig, Rachel was suggesting that, you need to be a value and a purpose-led brand, or, you need to be more than just your widget. So what are you seeing in the research you're doing about customer preferences? I mean, do customers really know what they want? Are they, how have format preferences evolved in North America in recent years? And how is this, how are customers responding to change?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Rachel more. It's, I think, still a key driver of what people choose when they go in, and still most people are going in person rather than getting things online, is that THC content and potency and the format that they choose. But what's emerging over the last few years is use cases and occasion is driving what people choose. So in the very beginning, dry flower was the dominant format. And since then, it's just been a steady march of edibles and drinkables to a lesser extent. Year after year, they keep stepping up their market share. Still dry flower, is ahead in terms of the main format, or the one that you use most often. That's around 38% of users say they use dry flower versus 27% who say edible. But when you ask them what formats have you used at all in the past year, you'll see that actually edibles come out a little bit ahead of dry flower. And what's driving that? We see it especially in focus groups. So it's about the occasion. So are they using on their own? At the end of the day, then if they're a dry flower user, they're gonna stick with dry flower. But then when they have a neighborhood party to go to, and they want to hang out with their neighbors, and they want to have some THC in their system, a lot of people are choosing edibles in those cases, right? Because they don't necessarily want to have to step outside or make a big show of it, because still only 27% of people are using cannabis in Canada. So they'll use edibles. Or if they go to a concert and they want to sort of enter that stadium and have some cannabis in their system, then they'll be using edibles. And then if they're sitting around a campfire, most people are drinking beer or wine, they're going to have their drinkable with them. So this is the kind of stuff that we're hearing, these sort of stories about the different occasions and use cases where occasion is very much driving usage, and nobody's tied into one format like they were in the beginning. Now they're using different formats for different occasions. And it's fascinating to hear those stories.
Michelle,
I'd argue that nobody ever used one format. I think that's something that legal companies sort of presume, right? And I think it's so interesting to watch the market data. I love people like Craig who are, you can really track and sort of see how we mature over time. But category drift is a really interesting thing to not get caught up in as a brand. There's a real misconception that people will leave one category to choose another, that as we see pre-rolls starting to kind of compete with whole flower for the dominant category, that somehow whole flower will start to come down, that as if people are giving up whole flower for pre-rolls. But I think that's a misnomer. As consumers mature, they adopt new delivery methods. So if they came in only with edibles, they will eventually try a vape pen, and they will try a little whole flower here or there. They might try an oil. So they diversify as a consumer. You don't necessarily lose them in one category to move to the other. And that's, I think, a great opportunity for brands to think about as well, is how do you migrate a user from one format to another based on the occasion and your recommendation. So just to But great point there, Craig. I love the
Yeah,
depth.
and I agree. And one of the things that's allowing people to sort of expand their format use too is just that it's legal, so it's perceived as safe, right? So before, some people, a certain segment of the market of users was afraid of edibles because they weren't sure what was in there. And now they can go to their store and feel like, I know that this is regulated and it's safe.
Yeah, and let's not forget that those newer cannabis classes have only been, in the legal industry since 2015. So, before that, medical patients only really had the option for dried flower and then eventually oils. And then, so this is kind of used. You're also transitioning those medical patients that were used to that kind of, way of thinking, way of usage to now the options in the recreational market. So yeah, I mean, I think as the industry evolves, we're going to start seeing all of these changes as, the consumers change, and also Health Canada starts to evolve, and they have more data that helps to inform their policy decisions so that they can make different choices right now. Because even when we're talking about linking the experience and linking usage, there are usages that people are looking for, like going to sleep, right? But you can't say that still really in products. And from where I sit, I see, I've worked at Health Canada. I know some of the compliance actions that have been out there. And also, working with clients who have received letters from Health Canada, right? And they could say something very passively, like I have, there's a product and they say the word dream. And then, Health Canada's like, oh, you're not supposed to say that. You're linking it to, a sleep aid and all these things. So like the way that you present the information also has to be very strategic and informational and somewhat separate, but somehow allow the consumer to make the connection. So yeah, so there's just like a lot of thought that needs to go around even the experience.
And you mentioned some way the restrictions and the regulations and there's been a lot of criticism as well, and you must have seen a lot of that. So in terms of about harm reduction measures and what brands are doing really to be perceived as being safe or be safe actually. So what do you think societies in US and Canada, how are they doing in terms of preventing underage use of cannabis, preventing overdose, overpossession, not having the right information, or just not even having the right compliance procedures? It can be hard to navigate this, but so it's not always intentional, as you know. But what are your thoughts about harm reduction? How are we faring as societies in that?
Mm-hmm. I would say that overall, in like independent of what jurisdiction you're going to, that the regulatory agencies of those jurisdictions, whether it's Canada, US, or other parts of the world, they really do share the same pillars when they're either when they have a regulatory recreational framework in place, like in many states in the US, and then of course in Canada, and then jurisdictions that are looking to implement a recreational framework, and they tend to look at the same things. So there's a lot of uniformity. So they'll look at preventing and minimizing drug diversion, organized crime. They'll look at ensuring the health and safety of the public, and that includes protecting youth and young persons. So they'll kind of like look at it with that lens. So as a result, there really is a focus on regulation, education, and compliance that ensures the safety and overall, minimizing those types of risks. So as part of that, harm reduction efforts are part of that, although I would say that it is sometimes fragmented, depending on what jurisdiction you're in. Particularly in the US, there is variation in state laws that create that fragmentation in harm reduction. But I would say that there's growing emphasis overall on education and safety standards. And when these regulations are implemented or being drafted, there's a lot of consideration on how tax and funding for those types of programs can go into other avenues that can help reduce harm or can benefit others who are active participants in the industry overall. And then there are other measures that are worked into the regulations, like preventing underage use, preventing overdose by setting a particular limit of THC content in products, so that that's largely based on evidence from research and other data they've collected to set those particular limits. There's, as we know, discussion on if that limit is too low, and if it should be higher, and there's arguments for that as well. And then there's regulation on the possession limits themselves, what you could possess in public, which there is some variation of that, depending on which jurisdiction that you're in. So those are a few areas, and then the compliance aspects of all regulations and enforcement that ensures that those limitations are being managed, so that in the long run, it will help to minimize harms that are related to cannabis. And we are seeing things like decriminalization in British Columbia that helps to promote safe usage. So as I think, again, as the industry evolves, I think that there's definitely going to be more efforts put towards how can we help the industry as a whole, so that we continue to move forward.
Okay. Michelle, you had some thoughts about the risk in legal products, about possession, and you were saying something about the physician side and educating them. What are your thoughts on harm reduction and responsible use, as you're seeing brands trying to communicate with their consumers and patients trying to record their usage with you?
I think education is a really big one. I think in Canada we're doing a pretty good job with where harm isn't as big of an issue as in the US, where there's so many more products that are marketed as candy and things like that. And I think that's like such a risk for kids. I think the 10 milligram limit I'm all for it. Like, I know a lot of people think that it can be increased, and I understand why, but I think from a harm, like if a non-user or a kid gets a edible in their hand, or I think it's a safe limit. I think that one way, other than just having the product limits or marketing limits, is education. And I think education can be from a couple places. I think for people who are using it for medical reasons or recreational reasons. I think doctors, this is a whole other area of discussion, but if doctors had more education, or like if there was more education for doctors to be able to talk to their patients about what to use, that could reduce harm for sure. I think being able to know what even a rec user going into a store, like what is a appropriate dose. I know that doesn't come from doctors, but I think just somehow if people can get more education, I think young people or people new to the category, I'm sure in school they're learning, just like don't do it, instead of maybe like a safe limit could be this. Like, just I think there's education to put it in the hands of the customer or the consumer or the patient. They'll be more aware when they go into however they're buying it, whether it's legal or non-legal, just to be able to have a sense of, okay, no, this might be too much. I know that's not going to be for everybody, but I think some harm reduction can come from education.
Lisa, how are you tracking harm reduction in brands in the US, or how are you seeing progress made, or tracking, okay, this was a better year for us as a society, or in a certain market. So do you have any thoughts about harm reduction in the States, and whether it's Ohio or whether it's in Texas or wherever else?
So I agree with everything that was said. Here, it is definitely more fragmented based on the states. It is still very hard to get into a dispensary unless you're 21. It's not necessarily like kids are going in and able to purchase legally. A lot more of the issue is what can they access at home or and whatnot. Here we've seen, like in Colorado, and what a lot of the states have done is part of, I think Sherry mentioned this, but part of the taxes from cannabis will go to sort of statewide education or programs like that. And when I was in Colorado, they would have billboards all around town that would talk about where you could or couldn't consume, what the minimum dose was. So for example, in Colorado, the edibles dose is like 10 milligrams, which I personally think is a little bit high as the kind of starter for one, but they would have billboards all around town that would be like, go slow or go low, and sort of encourage people to take that 10 and cut it into 2 or 3 as more of a micro dose, for lack of a better word, if they're first starting. Oh, I had one other thing I was going to say on that. Oh, so in different states also have different regulations on what they consider marketing to children and sort of how strict it is. So there are some states that don't even allow fruit flavors or images. Like you can't put a banana on a package because they see that as appealing to children. There's other states where they've actually in Oregon changed strain names. So Girl Scout cookies was a strain name, and there was a whole issue around that. There is a national brand here called Cookies that there's been some controversy around. Is just that by nature of it attractive to children. So it definitely depends on the state and how they do it and what they consider. But it is still a fairly high bar, I would say. But there's definitely work to be done. And some states too, from the marketing and advertising perspective, will, like Nevada, for example, any marketing campaign you want to do, you actually have to submit it to the state. They have paperwork that you fill out and submit to the state. You can't necessarily independently make those decisions. Other states, not so much. And then, and then there's a range across the board, right? Colorado's had legal cannabis, the Northwest since 2014. Texas still, is far behind in different ways. So really kind of depends on what you are. But overall, I would say the states are working on education. There definitely needs to be more of a national strategy for it, but we need national kind of everything here at this point. And brands doing better education to adults as well, as far as how to store it, how they can consume it, what makes sense for them. So yeah, but otherwise, I think honestly, Sherry and Michelle really got the high level.
Okay, so regulations, as you've all mentioned, have been tough, and especially for cannabis brands dreaming of global success. And we've battled the struggles of issues like low supply of cannabis, and then oversupply, and then low profitability for cannabis brands, where now only 1 in 5 cannabis businesses are reporting a positive cash flow. This is based from the research done by the Cannabis Council of Canada. And then now, even 5 years into legalization of recreational, the illicit drug trade controls 33% of the market shares. And Web3 technologies are still operating in this regulatory gray area as well. So what is your hope from any regulatory reform in our national or global or digital cannabis business environments? And whether this includes Web3 or even if it does not. So I guess we can start with who wants to, maybe Sherry or
updates to regulations. Well, I mean, the list is so long.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think we certainly don't need more regulations like a hole in the head in some ways, but in other ways, we are desperate for more regulations. Like I think about the laboratory space and kind of the requirements for vape pen testing and things before it hit market. Those kinds of things certainly concern me going into the next phase of legalization. I think when I think of Web3 and sort of like conflating cannabis and Web3 now together, I mean, when I look at the AI space, which is, all anybody in marketing talks about, and right now, right, everybody was just like trying to figure out what's AI going to do. Will it steal our jobs, or can we figure out how to work with it? That kind of thing. There's a lot of concern about the regulation of AI. The regulation, I mean, I was even reading recently about sort of the environmental impact of blockchain. Like we haven't really vetted out all of these great grandiose next technological ideas to really figure out how will they help us as a society, where might there be downfalls as a society, how do we bring regulations to bear on that to help protect the people that need to be protected. I mean, AI is considerably biased right now. As a woman in cannabis, that's a real problem considering the lack of diversity that exists in this space as it is today, and gets worse every year by every measure. When we start implementing additional technologies like that add additional layers of biases, I think, that can create real problems for the people who are already experiencing multiple layers and intersections of issues getting into the industry, being successful in the industry, finding funding in the industry. I'd love to see regulations around things like diversity and inclusion. I mean, there are places like California now that regulate like publishing that information if you're a private equity firm and sort of in your investments and whatnot. I think those kinds of measures are incredibly important for forcing the hand of creating change in institutional structures that have not changed in hundreds of years and need to change quickly in order for us to really adapt to what's coming for all of us. I mean, I think in some ways, digital technology is fantastic. We think about the possibilities of the metaverse, the possibilities of all of these technologies, but we do still live on a physical planet. And so at the end of the day, we can all disassociate into our VR goggles. But if we're not really addressing like what's happening here in real life every day, how are we protecting real human beings, those kinds of things as we evolve, I think, there's not enough benefit to all of it to sort of offset the potential costs if we don't really think about that. So I wish that regulators would turn their attentions to some of those kinds of things and lay off a little bit on the parsings of the nitpicky stuff that I think we could, that the legacy market did okay with and nobody died. And it's not like we had thousands of people dropping dead because edibles were available in a 200 milligram format. We can certainly talk about when and where and how they should be packaged to keep everyone safe, like for sure. But I think there's some things that we're like nuancing about that maybe don't need the nuance and leaving other things that actually could serve for a little bit more nuance and aren't being really addressed. But I think that in some ways, this is the nature of starting an industry from scratch, right? It's still very early days. Even if you look at Colorado, California, it's very early days. Governments do not move quickly. So I have lots of hopes. And I think if you're in this for the long game, it's only going to get better by all of the measures. We all hope it will get better. But it's a difficult place to be in lots of spaces for the regulations at the moment.
Yeah, I think that what I would love to see is just general harmonization of the regulations across the different jurisdictions, because it is so segmented and it makes it very challenging for companies to enter other markets and really expand their portfolio of business. It's hard to get a sense of what are consistent product standards and testing standards, and there are many jurisdictions, like in Canada themselves. Health Canada has a consultation right now out on a piece of land. They're trying to standardize, but also, the different states in the US, there's so much diversity in what is required from even a testing perspective and just, the product standardization. And, testing facilities, for example, are asking regulators to standardize. So I think, from the regulation perspective, as Rachel's saying, it would be nice not to have more complexity added to it, but it would be great, I think, if there's some level of harmonization that could also help with development of international treaties and those trade efforts. With AI, I mean, that's definitely, a hot topic for regulators as well. I had a call with one of the directors in the medical devices department, and they were saying that, they're really interested in putting it to the forefront on how they could regulate companies who are creating medical devices that incorporate AI. And as we know, that is also applicable to cannabis, because there are companies that are using medical devices that incorporate cannabis as, an administration method. And they're kind of trying to understand, okay, well, how are we going to regulate this? How are we going to create consistency? What guidelines are we going to provide to industry so that they can operate compliantly? And it is complex when you're looking at, data that's going across platforms and, open platforms and going through, different platforms with AI, because in a regulated industry, you also want to make sure that you're not stepping outside of compliance unintentionally. And how are you going to manage all of that? So that, I think, makes it a little bit complex, but I think some regulatory guidance is needing in what format that comes to us in. That's up to see how that's going to come out, but some sort of clear guidelines or framework on how we can efficiently use these types of technologies in the industry would be useful. And of course, banking needs to change. As we're a company that doesn't even touch product, and we even have issues with banking. So, as a service provider. So I think that should be top priority somehow on how we could reconcile, those challenges in that aspect of our industry.
Yeah.
If I could chime in, from my client's point of view, the number one issue is bringing down these excise, these hidden taxes, because it's existential for a lot of these producers now, that they're breaking even or losing money on their sales. And that's something we need either, especially on the provincial level than on the federal level. Some provinces are a little bit greedier than others, to bring down those taxes so that we can allow this industry to thrive and actually make some money. And then the other thing that I've been asking some survey questions on is allowing drinkables in restaurants. This is quite a normalized piece of consumption now, and for some reason, we can't have drinkables in a bar where people are also drinking alcohol. So I mean, I've asked questions about this, and the public supports it virtually across the board in every province, and that would be a regulation that I would like to see.
Does anyone have any advice for improving access to capital or funding or other support for those looking to, build and grow their business models with cannabis and Web3 or reading Web3?
I'll say, I think there are a lot of companies that are in the Web3 space that are interested in cannabis and working, and there is so much data collected through whether it's sales data, consumption data, government data. Like, there's so much data that can be used in AI or for things like that. And I think, I know for us, or talk to a lot of AI companies or doing projects with them, there are opportunities. And I think in terms of access to capital, I think those are in some markets, it's these kinds of companies that are raising money. I mean, there's a little bit of a, I guess we'll say, there was when Canadian companies were raising money, we all saw what happened, right, in the market. So I don't think cannabis is a safe bet for many investors. I'm not saying like anyone specifically, but just overall as an industry. And there is a lot of growth coming from the Web3 area. So I think there is opportunity for cannabis the players in the cannabis industry to align themselves with Web3 companies. And I think access to capital is much more available to them. And if there were to be alliances or partnerships that could help. And I think that there could be a lot of good things that come out of it. I think, as we've said, there's so many regulations for the cannabis industry. Same as Sherry, like we don't touch the product, and banking is an issue, and we just we're data, right? Like it's ridiculous for companies to be able to have the same kind of expectations as they do in other industries when it comes to banking and finance. But I think there's opportunities because I've seen it, we've seen it. Lots of companies are going into different markets. And if you're using Canadian data or North American data, you in a company, say a blockchain company or AI company that's in another country, great. I mean, we could learn from each other. It doesn't have to be that use. You don't have to be limited. I think the data is so usable anywhere with these technologies that you could have potentially new opportunities with international markets.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we just have time for our last final conclusive question, and it's this to everyone. If you had to apply all the consumer data, customer data, market data, and network analyses and other relationships data that you had to forecast or envision a web-enabled future for cannabis in 2030, what is it going to look like?
I think the combination of regulatory change and hopefully sophisticated, thoughtful, and grounded implementation of AI can come together. I know some folks, so ChatGPT now has where you can train your own bots. And I know companies that have individuals, consultants who have put in Colorado's regulation, train the bot on it, and they ask that bot questions instead of working with consultants necessarily directly, or they use it to supplement their understanding for their team. That at scale could be really powerful if it's implemented correctly. For here, we just need federal reform so bad because so much comes down from that it's hard to kind of see beyond that. Everyone's, chomping at the bit to be able to take their next steps, do interstate commerce, standardize, not have to get separate license partners in every state, rewrite the brand, it's so different by each state. So as companies try to scale, they hit so many blocks here. And really the only ones that are truly able to are the ones that have really deep pockets and good funding, because it is such an expensive lift. And that creates, changes in the market that I think would be nice to see more of a level playing field or opportunity for smaller businesses to compete on the same way. I will say we've been doing a lot of research on AI and marketing, and there's a group out of the UK called the Advertising Association AI Task Force. They're meeting for the next year. They meet every 6 weeks. It's co-chaired by Google, so take that for what it's worth. But they've identified like the top 5 concerns for AI in marketing. And if I'm quoting this correctly, it's accuracy, consent, employee morale, ownership, and I forget the last one. It'll come to me after I'm done. But the only one within any of our control is employee morale. The rest is like a technology issue. So one of the things I've been talking to our members about is your employees are very concerned about AI. There's been a lot of data on this and a lot of research. And from a marketing perspective, being able to start to tackle that conversation, see how you're implementing it within your organization, train your team on AI is maybe the one thing we can do as individuals and humans who don't co-chair Google and are not creating these technologies to be able to kind of work with it as it moves forward and, continue to advocate for it with your government. We're going to have an open public comment period soon on the rescheduling. So we're starting to talk to everybody about what does that look like? What should we say? And how do we, while we're in this chance, have some input in what's happening going forward before it becomes a runaway train, so to speak.
Anyone wants to add to what we just said about your vision for 2030?
Yeah, I think in addition to what Lisa is saying too, I what's really going to be advantageous is having a supply chain that's super transparent and efficient, because companies are trying to be as efficient as possible, make sure that they're streamlined and can be cost effective and cost efficient throughout all aspects of their business. So any way that they can optimize their business through advances in technology, it's definitely an area that companies will begin to leverage. And regulators are also going to have to move towards understanding how they need to do better from the regulatory and compliance perspective to accommodate the changes, because it's inevitably happening and they're going to have to adapt. 2030, I guess it's only 6 years. It's not too much time, but I think it's enough time for significant changes to happen. And I think another aspect that is going to become increasingly important is just having a personalized customer experience. So people are going to start using more AI-driven data to really determine how they can make the best decisions for themselves. And companies that are supporting those types of data are going to be, it's going to be to their advantage if they're able to adapt to create something that will help to bring in their customers. And as we were talking about loyalty and bringing having that customer retention. So I think that's just where the industry is naturally going to begin to evolve to, at least in the earlier stages, and then perhaps it'll become to something bigger where there are global decentralized marketplaces and global changes and networks that can make the industry just become advanced in the sense of how it is with other consumer products, and it would be more aligned with that. So we'll see. Maybe not 6 years, but maybe as we move along to 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah. Craig, Rachel, Ada, do you have any thoughts on this vision for 2030? Would like to hear yours as well here.
For myself, hearing what everybody has said so far in this panel, I would agree that one of the first things that need to get resolved, I suppose, in the next 6 years or so is definitely the regulatory and taxation and financial and supply chain constraints, right, in the next little while. It's, if all of that can be more or less resolved in the next 6 years, I would think that by 2030, the next biggest thing that we need to start to map out is, well, if brands are able to better communicate themselves to consumers, how will they do that, and what are they communicating? And I think one of the pieces that could feed into that, I think research can start now, essentially, to start to look at what are some of these barriers that people feel psychologically, at the very least, when they interface with cannabis and Web3. It is kind of known, I think, as Lisa mentioned, right? People's feelings around AI, there's a lot of concerns around accuracy and how much can I trust it, and there's a certain level of skepticism. But digging deeper into what people's perceptions are is going to be key now, because as regulatory issues are getting resolved, we need to start to more and more so understand what consumers' hesitations might still be, even if everything's, all the environmental constraints are resolved. There still may be psychological concerns that people have, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the talk. But there needs to be a lot more research done now to understand the consumer mindset, so that we can prepare ourselves on how might we talk about cannabis and its interface with Web3 in the future, when we're able to.
Thank you. Michelle, Rachel, Craig, last words?
I agree with what everyone's saying about the reforms and all those different areas that are necessary. I think Web3 can help if companies are open to, I don't want to say using it, because we all, just as Lisa said, there's all those issues with it, but I think there's potential. I think that companies really need to think about their consumers and understand cannabis, to be honest. Like, it's not just the same as, say, like alcohol, where it's a certain one molecule or like a composition of a drink. Like, alcohol is in terms of like the way that the liquid is. Like, cannabis is very different. It interacts with everybody very differently. I think a lot of people who are not only advising or making these regulations or working at these companies, not everybody, but I think that a lot of people just see cannabis as like cannabis is cannabis, where it really is very unique. And I think that needs to be understood in how companies communicate and develop their products. And I think that AI can really help, because there is a lot of information out there, even whether it's like scientific studies about the plant and things like that. I think that's important for companies to know, so they have a real understanding of what it is that they're selling. But of course, all these regulations need to be changed a little bit to make the industry to be able to grow and develop and have banking and have marketing and have all these things to allow it to grow. But I think there's some really good potential that can help the companies and help people, and just have a mature, it won't be mature in 6 years, but get us to the next step of the industry.
I mean, 6 years, it's so funny. If you had asked me 6 years ago, 2030, I would have speculated all of these grand things. But now we can sort of start to see how time affects in cannabis. So 6 years isn't long. I mean, we will speculate to see, something national happen in the States, which will change everything for everyone. So the important thing to remember about that is the US is the bank for many other countries. So I spent some time in Barbados in 2019. And their massive problem is the US is their bank. So if they move faster than the US moves in their regulations and whatnot, they risk alienating the people who, provide most of their credit for their entire country. So I think US going national is massive, and it's sort of like a domino effect. Predicting that domino effect, ask anybody and you'll get 12 different answers. So exactly what will happen and exactly what that means, and how good is it and who is it good for in the beginning is all still speculative. But I think rising tides lift all boats, and in that sense, it's good for all of us in terms of progression. My hope is that two things that technology will do is, like Michelle, all of you have sort of hit on, is trust and legitimization are two things that our industry still significantly struggles with. And I think that feeds to what Ada was saying about there's still a lot of a stigma from all different kinds of areas and angles around cannabis as a product and the cannabis industry as an industry. Now that we've had many companies go public, many companies fall flat on their faces, many people lose their shirts, there's a lot of stigma and ideas about what this thing is that we're doing over here. And my hope is that the technology will allow us to continue to create trust with both consumers, but also lawmakers, policymakers across the board, demonstrate that we are trustworthy people and doing trustworthy business like all other kinds of businesses, and therefore then be treated like all other kinds of businesses and be supported in the ways that will really help this industry actually function and grow like it needs to as a global industry. My hope is that Web3 and all the new technology will be a utility to us doing those things. I don't think it, naturally makes all of our lives easier overnight necessarily, but I do think the trust and legitimacy are two massive factors that are still hindering us in every way, whether you're from a brand perspective out to a consumer, or from the regulatory perspective and compliance perspective. Those are still massive problems for everybody at every point in the supply chain. So that's my hope for like what the next few years might bring in terms of technology.
I'm so focused on these days with regulations and helping our clients try and get change there. But when I'm looking at Web3 and technology going forward, this is a case of the industry. In different industries, you'll see consumers driving change, and then in other industries, you'll see the industry driving change. In this case, consumers aren't that tapped into Web3. So this is a case of the industry leading that change. And I do think that there's a need in this industry to sort of lend some excitement to it again. There was excitement in the beginning, and we've seen usage kind of plateau at around the quarter mark, like 25 to 27% using. And while those users continue to use and are enjoying it, there does seem to be a bit of a malaise. And I think having technology step up and help personalize things for people, educate people, and make things easier. For me, that's where the industry with technology can help improve things down the road and pray, add some more spark to this industry again.
Thank you, everyone. I think that those are some wonderful thoughts from all of you, and I think gives our communities a lot more to think about in terms of what we can do and how to lead change, and both in our respective roles, in our respective organizations, and in our respective industries, no matter what role we are playing in cannabis. So thank you, Lisa, Rachel, Sherry, Craig, Michelle, Ada. So this was a great panel. Hope if anyone is here can please reach out for any follow-up questions if you need to connect with any of our community members. We'll now move on to a presentation which Ada has prepared about the use of behavioral science and in some of the other concepts she talked about in brand messaging and around cannabis, and in dispelling any fears and myths. So Ada, the stage is yours. You can share your screen if you'd like to begin. And I urge everyone, also whoever was able to please stay. We'd love to hear your thoughts as well. And we just have a small Q&A after Ada's presentation is done, and then we'll close.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, once I start sharing my screen, I can no longer see anybody or anything. Just so you know. So if there are any hands or questions coming up in the chat, I can't see any of it. But happy to answer afterwards. Yeah, so I think the discussion we had just now was really enlightening in terms of understanding where the current state is for cannabis and what the potential could be, and where the next steps ought to be. Just to preface this talk, I would say that talking about overcoming these sort of psychological barriers to embracing cannabis, as a whole, psychologically, it's one of those things where this has to come after the regulatory and the financial and the tax and the supply chain issues. Though those absolutely need to get resolved first, and then we can start thinking about addressing these sort of psychological barriers that consumers might have around embracing cannabis. One of the things that we know from behavioral science is that a lot of times regulatory changes can drive huge changes in how consumers perceive and what their feelings are around something like cannabis. Policy changes, can be really big. And it's one of those things where, we can see what happens once there are big regulatory changes that happen, and how consumer mindset shifts as a result of that. And then, once we can see how consumers are feeling about cannabis after the regulatory change, then we can start to address any sort of remaining psychological barriers that consumers might have around cannabis. And there will almost always be remaining psychological barriers that people have, even if everything is legalized and, there are no more supply chain or banking constraints around cannabis. So that's kind of the preface and context for this talk. I would say that this is definitely a future state conversation, but it's one that is worth having now, because if we have our eyes on 2030, well, 6 years will come and go very, very quickly. And there's a lot of thinking and research that we can start doing now to understand psychologically where consumers are in preparation for the time that regulatory changes come about. So maybe to start off, take a step back away from cannabis just for a quick moment. In general, as human beings, I would say that we like to think of ourselves as rational beings, and we like to think of ourselves as people who make good logical decisions most of the time, as long as we have the right information and education. But the funny thing is that, the reality is that that's not always the case. Many times we as humans are a lot more irrational than we like to believe. So I'll give a somewhat personal example. This is the picture of my husband. And a week ago, him and we had a day off together. We took a Monday off, sent our kid into school and then daycare. So we didn't have work. We didn't have our kid with us. And so we thought to ourselves, wow, great. What can we do today? We didn't really have a plan. Our plan was only that we would have the day off and send our kid off and we would be free. But otherwise, we didn't really have a plan. So we drop our kid off at school, and then we're like, yeah, what are we going to do now? And we're so excited. And we were really hungry because it was, past 9, and, we're like, oh, the world's our oyster. What could we do? And eventually we somehow landed at a dim sum place. And it was already noon by the time we got there, and still very excited, but super, super hungry. And so they had a menu where you could check off the food items that you could order. And I think our eyes were bigger than our stomach, and we ended up ordering way too much food. And so this is a picture of when all the food came, and we were sitting there like, oh my goodness, how are we going to eat all this stuff? This is the worst. This is the biggest mistake. And so what ended up happening is we only ate about a third of the food and had to pack the rest of it. And one of these, something like this actually happens to so many of us on a day, regularly. You get really excited, you make impulsive decisions, and then later on you come to regret it. And the reality is that making decisions while being very emotionally charged is a lot more common than we like to admit. So impulse buying, for example, is driven a lot by excitement, investment behaviors, right? How people choose to put money into their stocks or pull their money out of stocks. A lot of it is driven by fear. Being willing to engage in behaviors that are good for the environment, so these sustainability behaviors, are sometimes hindered by people feeling annoyed that it's so inconvenient to just be environmentally friendly. And anger sometimes can drive a lot of our work communications, where we end up saying things that are ultimately not helpful and not constructive. And then very in the moment, but it's the emotion that's really driving our behavior there. And the same thing goes around people being receptive to new types of treatment options, such as cannabis for medical use, this sort of emotional rejection of these new options can be driven by fear, for example. So there's a lot of instances where, emotions can really override our logic. And this is part of the reason why information and education aren't always as effective as we would hope. We, of course, cannot deny that information and education is the foundation. We absolutely need to have it, just as we need, regulatory and financial and supply chain and tax, foundations for an industry. Information and education are absolutely necessary. But oftentimes what we will find is that once the information and education is out there, that you'll hit a ceiling in terms of how much you're able to change people's perceptions and behavior. The example I've grabbed here is actually from the smoking cessation campaigns that have been out there for decades. It started off as a lot of information-based campaigns going out there about the harm that cigarettes can have for people and all the very concrete consequences that it can have for people's life. But despite that, what we find is that a lot of these anti-smoking campaigns don't reach the results that we hope, despite the big budgets being put behind them. And so, given that there could be this gap still in how do we change people's perceptions and behavior, well, I believe that the answer might be coming from looking into the remaining psychological barriers that people have, and how do we address those remaining psychological barriers. So let's come back to cannabis. The question, therefore, I would ask is, well, given this, something to think about now and plant and work on in anticipation of the future is, well, what emotions are evoked in people when they interface with cannabis? And really, of course, we could say a range of emotions are possible, right? Ranging from excitement to fear to, extreme hesitation, for example. And really, the reality is that the exact emotion highly depends on why someone might be approaching cannabis and who this person is. We know that from research based in Canada and the US, that the reasons are roughly split into thirds. So roughly, as of today, a third of people will say, well, I use cannabis and I'm interested in cannabis for recreational use. About a third of people will say, well, I would consider it for medical. And about a third would say, maybe it's a bit of both. And really, some of the other factors we need to think about, well, is this person a new or existing user? Is this the first person in their own, social personal network to try to approach cannabis? And is this a person whose cultural and historical experience tells them that cannabis is a normal thing? And I think this was kind of brought up in our panel discussion that the individual experience that people have with cannabis can be so varied. It's very different from people's interaction with consumer packaged goods, right? It's a very idiosyncratic experience. And so, we really need to think through who is this person and what kind of experiences and emotions may they come to the table with, given that it's known that it is a very individual experience that people may have. So for the purpose of today's talk, perhaps let's maybe just focus on the hardest group of people to really convince and get to and to reach. And I would argue that the hardest group is not those who are already convinced that cannabis might be something that's fun and exciting for them or even necessary for them. It is not the people who are absolutely desperate for a solution to their medical condition and feel that they've tried everything. And I would argue that the hardest group to convince might be those who feel a certain level of uncertainty and feel, somewhat unsure about whether cannabis is really for them. And this may not be the most prevalent group, especially after the regulatory changes come into effect, right? But it certainly will be the hardest group to convince going forward. And maybe for the purpose of today's talk, we can focus on those who feel uncertainty for cannabis use for medical purposes, just as an example. So there's something to focus on. So if we focus on people who feel unsure around medical use, we can start to think through what the barriers are that they face. When we think through the barriers, one aspect that we need to think about beyond barriers that they may face from an environmental perspective, right? From access to technology, those are kind of categorically environmental based barriers. We can also focus on what are their psychological barriers. And to do that, we can look across people's psychological journey from what are they aware or not aware about, what do they perceive, how do they decide or decide against, and ultimately, how do they act, whether they act or not, and what are some of the hindrances that they may face when they are at the point where they're ready to act. Time is limited today, so I'll focus on perception barriers only, perception factors, and let's focus a bit more on the emotional barriers that we need to address. Those are some of the most difficult things to tackle, really, because a lot of the emotions that people feel cannot be overcome a lot of times by information and education. Even if people know the right information and they know what's good, what's right, what's wrong, sometimes people cannot help but to feel how they feel, and emotions kind of require a different category of techniques to address. So on the emotion side, just to list out some of the potential emotional barriers that might exist around when people come about thinking of cannabis for medical reasons. Some of them might be, well, people may fear that it's really hard. There's a lot of complexity, right? It's very overwhelming to think through like what strain is best for me, what will my experience be like. We talked about stigma earlier today. There's a fear of being judged, a perceived social stigma. A lot of times, even if the information and education is already out there, social stigma takes a lot longer to be changed. There can be a fear of being alone, a perceived lack of social support. You know, will anybody in my personal network, my family and friends, will they understand my decision and support me through it? There's a fear of danger, especially if there's still a perceived lack of physician approval. And there's a general fear of the unknown. Even if the information is out there, there can still be a lack of knowledge. Lots of information, or especially when it's entangled with all things Web3, can be quite overwhelming. And so people can still have a lot of fears around, you know, what else am I missing? What else do I not know? Do I know everything that I need to know? And ultimately, there's also a fear to self-concept. A lot of times, you know, especially for adults, we have very strong self-concepts about who we are and who we want to be in our lives. And there can be a lot of misconceptions around who uses cannabis. And for the people who use cannabis, are these people the same people as me? And how might this link to my current self-concept? So there can be a lot of these sort of fear-based, emotional-based barriers that exist. And as mentioned, a lot of times information and education will not be enough to resolve people's emotional trepidations. So then the question is, well, when the time comes, what are some of the techniques we can use to overcome people's trepidation so that they, you know, are able to more rationally approach the information and education that's being presented to them so that they can properly navigate whether cannabis is the right fit for them for their medical conditions. I'll just talk about, you know, given the time constraints, I will very quickly talk about just some of the behavioral techniques that are possible out there that have been tried and tested in other realms, in other industries. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I would say that the most important thing to remember is that it's really important to match the technique directly to the barrier that we're concerned about. This set is directly targeted at addressing emotional barriers, and there can be other techniques that address different types of barriers outside of emotions. But nonetheless, let's talk through each of these very briefly. The very first thing I would mention is that where possible, depending on who is talking to the patient or to the consumer, is to really have an empathy-based conversation or empathy-based communication. It's more about perspective taking and less about jumping straight to solutions and straight to talking about the product and the features. It's about taking a step back and start by outline what are some of the common values that you may share with the consumer, with the audience. This image is an image from some of the work that we've done with the City of Toronto on helping door-to-door ambassadors navigate conversations that they have with community members about the COVID-19 vaccine. You may remember, a couple years ago, there was a lot of hesitancy at the public level around, should I get the vaccine? There was a big group of people who felt a lot of trust issues around getting vaccinated and whether it's really right for them. And so, what we find is that the conversation should not be at the level of the features of the vaccine and the benefits of the vaccine, but really going up, one level above and talking about what's the value and the purpose and the final outcome, and what are these common goals that we may have with the consumer. The other thing is to not try too hard to fight the emotion, and we can think through how might we be able to harness it. And it's really about reframing the anticipated negative emotion as an indicator of a desirable outcome. This is a little bit blue sky, but we can start to think about, maybe how Buckley's might have done it back in the 1980s, 1990s around their bad taste campaign. It was all around it tastes awful, but it works. And here, what marketers did was they really harnessed our disgust sensitivity around a bad flavor to shift us from rejecting this poor tasting cough syrup to embracing the awful taste and our disgust as a sign of its effectiveness. So I wonder if there's something around not fighting too hard against the emotion. And oftentimes what we find is that if we fight the emotion head on too hard, people will further stand their ground around their fears. But really, how can we harness it and reframe it and shift the way that people think about what their fear means and signals to them? And again, this is at a conversation above the product and above the features of the product, but it's at a level above, having that higher level conversation. The other things that have worked really well in other realms is to make the treatment feel familiar. So there are some, a lot of success that people have had through mere exposure. So this is depending on time, repeat exposure over time. So for example, when marketing campaigns are able to be done openly, right? How might a campaign with a very simple message be done on a, that's repeatedly promoted? The other way is actually to use analogies. What we know from psychology is that adults learn really well through analogies. And how can we draw parallels to things that people are already familiar with? And this can really help people learn new concepts and engage in critical thinking. So here the example is an analogy to snow and how you might slide through snow or ski through snow, and how might this be used to help people understand the use of psychedelics for mental well-being. So that's already being explored on the side of psychedelics for medical use. The other thing, I think a lot of marketers know this, is how can we use identifiable stories? So going beyond sharing data and facts, how can we use very personal stories told by individual people about how they went down the same road that the target audience might be thinking about going down. And the research, what's shown here is, interestingly, we know that stories work better than data. So that's the identifiable victim outperforming the statistical victim. But what's really interesting is that pairing the data point with the story actually hinders the effectiveness of the story itself. So you can see that on the third right-hand bar, where when you combine the data points with the story, that suddenly this doesn't work as well, because you reduce the effectiveness of this sort of emotional-based reasoning that people may start to engage in when they're faced with a personal story. So something to watch out for. If you're going to use stories, just focus on the story and try not to pair it with data. And the reason is that, as mentioned, this sort of emotional-based reasoning, it's all about reducing that emotional distance that people may feel between themselves and other people who have gone through the same experience. It's about reducing that emotional distance. Last one, used a lot in clinical psychology to help people overcome anxiety and phobias, is something called successive approximation. Probably not something that is done at a marketing level, at a brand level, but more at perhaps the clinical level, that physicians or clinicians can start to think about how they might be able to ease people into thinking about cannabis as a potential for medical benefits. Is successive approximation, also known as shaping, which is really about starting people with a much easier and less aversive task, and slowly guiding and reinforcing them through more difficult and more aversive tasks. For example, one of the things I think we talked about in the panel is that oftentimes, people feel that edibles might be a lot more approachable than other forms of cannabis, and that's a question mark. For everybody, can that be posed as a foot in the door type entry point for someone who might be interested in exploring cannabis for medical uses? So that's really it. That brings me to the end. It's, the key takeaway really is that we need to start at the level of absolutely providing the right information. But once that information is out there, we need to seek to understand what people are still feeling scared of, and how might we then further shape the information in terms of its content and its delivery, so that it's ultimately effective at addressing people's fears and emotions. So, emotions matter a lot, and I would say let's not forget about them.
Thank you, Ida. That was amazing. That was really insightful, and really loved how you gave all the examples of through to the case of medical cannabis. How do you think this journey is going to be when you move it to recreational cannabis? What would change if you were giving the example of recreational cannabis? Because I know you said something about necessity. Is it necessary? Yes, you can say that for medical, but what are your thoughts about how would this change if it was for recreational cannabis that you were talking about?
I think that for recreational purposes, I think there can be a lot more research done on looking at, are there any sort of psychological barriers that people face when it comes to recreational use? Arguably, it is already known that for people who are already existing users of cannabis for recreational use, right? Awareness is not as much of a problem. They've been using it for some time, and they're already familiar with the landscape and what's right for them. Maybe they have already done some exploration, and I guess one of the things we can think about is, do they have any remaining misconceptions or hesitancies around exploring other types of cannabis forms for themselves, and addressing those types of emotional barriers? I would say that as a whole, though, I would argue probably for recreational use that the emotional barriers are probably not as great as somebody who is interested in using, who might be eligible for using cannabis for medical uses. Because for someone who is interested in seeking fun and excitement, it is already known that that's kind of the outcome that they're aiming for. And so, for any sort of campaigns and marketing that are able to, to appeal to this group of consumers, you can kind of focus on that if that's possible from a regulatory standpoint. But I mean, overall, I would say that the principles still hold, even for recreational purposes. It's just a matter of degree, how many of these emotional barriers you really need to address. And I would say that for recreational purposes, it's going to be a lot less than for medical purposes, because for medical purposes, people will fear a lot more because their final goal is it's not for fun, right? It's not for excitement. It's really for a really perhaps a dire medical situation that you really want to resolve. For myself, for example, I'm a migraine sufferer and I've tried all the medications, and it was kind of at a point where I'm like, well, do I rely on drugs for my whole life, or do I start to explore something that could be equally effective and it isn't in the form of a pill? And it was, I had to overcome my own fears around cannabis for that. And it wasn't about fun. If it was about fun, it would have been a lot easier to convince me, I think. So yeah, I think there are fundamental differences between rec and medical uses and the emotional barriers that exist between the two groups.
Yeah. What techniques have proved most useful for you in really getting to understanding when you maybe know nothing about them, because especially after COVID, nobody knows who they're serving sometimes. So what have you observed?
What have I observed in terms of
measuring emotion? How has the ways that you measured emotion changed? How have they changed over time, and understanding this consumer in a changing category, in a changing time, even as people are changing their opinions and habits about it, or maybe they don't know about it. Like you talked about the unsure, the person being the most difficult person to understand. And what you shared helped, like at least with understanding, telling those stories. But still, how do you know which story is going to resonate with which one, with which type of user? What do you advise? Or how do you go about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that as a whole, we can certainly do some market research, right, to understand what people say their feelings are around cannabis. And there's many different ways from a market research perspective to get at what people will say. You can do it quantitatively. Ideally, you pair that qualitatively also, so you can dig much into a fuller story on what people are saying, and qualitatively you can start to parse out, read between the lines around what are they not saying that might signal some of their fears. But once you have those hypotheses around what their fears are, and you start to develop stories that address their fears, I think one of the most critical things is really to do some pilot tests first around the different stories. What we have found time and time again is that we are surprised by the exact version of a story that fundamentally appeals to people. There's different ways to frame different information. And I would say that we've been surprised many times that, the one story that we thought based on gut feel would really address an emotional barrier that people have doesn't end up actually being the one that wins. Especially when we're thinking about not just addressing people's emotional barriers, but ultimately we want to also encourage behavior change. And so you may find that certain stories are really great at changing emotions, but they're not simultaneously good at shifting behavior. And so ultimately, there's a lot of testing involved to see which are the exact stories that both change the emotions, shift the perceptions, as well as shift the behavior. So highly encourage testing. I think market research upfront, absolutely. But once there are sort of these creative concepts around how might you, tell the story around a brand and have that story appeal to consumers, there's a lot of testing that needs to be done, especially to measure how behavior can be changed.
Okay. And is there any particular stigma that you think has been very sticky or very difficult to eradicate, or that you think is going to require a lot more creativity and a lot more measurement to change the stigma about a certain thing right now in cannabis, whether it's around a certain perception around price or brand or even the product itself? Is there any particular stigma you think lingers that you think is going to prove to continue to be challenging? Like the number one most, when I'm going to ask about a stigma that you think has been difficult to tackle.
I would say that the most difficult stigma that we'll have to tackle is the stigma around who are the people who use cannabis. So this whole thing around self-concept. Anytime you have something where perceptions are linked to someone's self-concept, it is the most difficult thing to change, because people don't want to change the way that they think about themselves and who they are as a person. So if there are any sort of misconceptions or assumptions that people may have around, well, people like me aren't the people who use cannabis. It's these other types of people. It is potheads, and people's misconceptions about what potheads are and the stigma that came with the term pothead. I would say that that's the biggest thing that needs to be overcome. And I think that the number one way to overcome that is really around storytelling and stories, and not necessarily through fact. It's going to be really hard to convince somebody that, hey, actually, mom and a mom of two kids, moms of children in their middle age are actually the number one consumers of cannabis. It's that data point isn't going to be nearly as convincing as saying, hey, actually, their story about someone named, I don't know, Samantha, who, lives a particular life and chronic pain, and she's explored everything, and cannabis is sort of the thing that really gave her relief. And having those stories is going to be the key way to sort of help people shift their self-concept.
How do you think this is going to translate to skills we need to prepare people that are maybe entering cannabis or beginning to work with cannabis brands, or even people that are just entering the profession, maybe?
In terms, what kind of skills?
Yes.
What kind of skill sets do we need in people who are looking to enter into the cannabis industry?
Cannabis insights, like trying to, so you're saying that we, as cannabis insights people, you would need to understand the behavior, you need to understand what's going to drive behavior change, and you're going to need to understand what people's concepts of their self are, maybe, or what their values are. So what kind of skills are needed to understand this type of customer segment better and serve cannabis brands, maybe, or help them be better and more intelligent, be competitive?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that honestly, I was very, very impressed by the skill sets and the expertise that all the panelists came to today. And I think this group of people are the right people. And I would say that that going forward, right, one of the key elements that we need to incorporate in the insights and into the industry is an understanding of human psychology. That piece is going to be critical as regulatory constraints are changing, and all the other things are changing. Because there is a consumer at the other end, there's a need really for psychology to come into play, and behavioral science to come into the picture as a complement to the types of insights that we're looking for, and to really understand the consumer's mindset at a deep level. And we've seen other industries, fully embracing human psychology and behavioral science into their, the banking industry has done it, insurance, CPG has done it, healthcare to a certain extent has started to do it, and I would argue that for any industry, human psychology is going to be a critical component, as it is in all the other industries out there.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ada. That was a wonderful presentation. And if anyone needs to contact Ada, you can reach out to her LinkedIn or email her, and we'll send out the video of this presentation along with the full panel details to everyone's.
No, I really do appreciate everybody for taking the time today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ada. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rachel, Lisa, Pete, Sherry, our sponsors, and Michelle, and our sponsors, Lisa, as well as Sherry. That's the Sherry of CanDelta and Lisa of the Cannabis Marketing Association. We do this every year. This was a slightly smaller gathering. It has been a crazy, very busy year, but we'll definitely socialize much of this and build up to next year as well in a more stay in touch, and you'll hear from us. You'll hear from us soon.